Right, hi everyone. I'm just going to record a short video. Not much because you have a lot of work already this week, but I just thought I could do a summary which will prepare for the topic of next week, which will be the need for reform, particularly in looking at new inclusive frameworks such as universal design for learning. And so, what I'm going to share with you today is just one slide that summarizes 6 points which I have explored and picked up and analyzed in my own research. So, this slide pertains to higher education, the post-secondary sector, but in many ways, all of the conclusions from this research can be extended to K-12 as well, and we're faced there with very similar difficulties. So the point of this is really to summarize for any audience that really you're dealing with at present, the ways in which the system is broken. So, so far we've looked at the medical model, funding models, approaches, and you've started seeing a lot of the issues that are coming up. But this slide really aims to really summarize to the extent to which the system is broken, both the post-secondary system, process for inclusion, and the K-12 one as well. So this is data that was recorded over a period of 4 years when I was working as head of accessibility at McGill. It was collected through process triangulation, which means that it was collected almost through participatory action research, because we would go in and do workshops for faculty, staff, administration, student affairs, senior administration, and people would give us feedback about the way the arguments we were putting forward, etc. And people started making more suggestions as to what should be included. So we would walk in at first and do presentations to stakeholders, sometimes mentioning one or two ideas, and that toolbox, if you wish, has grown from the feedback of the participants. So we're pretty confident that this is a picture that now is fairly exhaustive when it comes to realizing the issues that are present in the system. So the first one is the changing demographics and the volumes of demands. From the year 2010, we really see increasing sort of an explosion really of demands for services for inclusion within both the K-12 and the post-secondary sector. To give you an idea, when I was at McGill, when I arrived in 2011. There were 550 fully registered users of accessibility services. When I left 4 years later, there were 3 times that numbers, and that kept growing. Any sort of K-12 environment or post-secondary environment within North America, you see these curves sort of exponentially rising from 2011 and not really seeming to end at all. Now, there are many reasons for this: changing societal attitudes, less stigma, people having better access to support, students generally being better advocates for themselves, parents being better advocates, etc. No one quite is able to really put their fingers down in terms of which specific angle has actually explained that radical increase. But the fact is that because of this increase, all of our systems of provisions are basically broken. All of what we've seen so far, these medical model, deficit model approaches, are models that were really put in place in the 1960s, 1970s, where really in schools and in post-secondary institutions, all you had in terms of diversity were students with visual impairments, students with mobility impairments, and students with hearing impairments. So sometimes as less than 0.5% of our student population. We're now often in situations where even in the post-secondary sector, we're getting to 10, sometimes over 10% of the student population that actually makes requests for accommodations. So the system is broken in that sense that it's unsustainable, even in purely strategic organizational sort of numbers. You've seen some of our guest speakers talk about waiting times, talk about bottleneck, lack of fund, lack of resources. So doing things the way we've been doing them is no longer really sustainable in terms of the demands that we're facing. And we're not quite sure what the top of that curve is going to be and whether those increases are going to continue for a while still. The second point is the fast changing shift in definitions and the explosion of diagnosis. So again, most of our models, both in K-12 and in post-secondary, have been created in the 60s, where again, 3 traditional forms of disability and impairment, a relatively short scope of know-how, of knowledge that people needed to have to be able to support those students. We have now a wide sort of spectrum of diagnoses and impairments within schools that go all the way from significant psychiatric disorders all the way to chronic medical conditions. So this notion of having someone available to do remedial targeted interventions, right, which is still the model under which we function. You've seen this when Pam Gurney talked to you about the system, or when you've had those guest speakers from the post-secondary. We have so far imagined that someone has enough specific knowledge to craft individual remedial interventions for that impairment or that diagnosis. Now, it is quite clear, again, from the angle of sustainability, that we do not have the capacity within our schools and our universities to actually be able to provide those targeted individual remedial actions now with a full spectrum of diagnosis that we have, because we simply would have to have everything from a resident psychiatrist all the way to a resident doctor on the premises, which is never the case in any institution in education. So again, this is one of the aspects which really lends us to say that the system is broken and beyond capacity, because we are continuing to try and provide individual targeted diagnostic interventions where really we don't have the know-how in-house to be able to do that. The third aspect is the urgency of integrating the social model. I'm not going to go over this too much because we've had obviously sessions on the social model, and you've had a presentation from your group on the social model. But let's just say that, your group was quite correct in identifying, Colin Barnes, etc., Tom Shakespeare as being some of the leaders in the coining of that term. It was coined in the 1970s, so we're now talking about 52 years ago. And it hasn't become a reality. So again, this is a way in which the system really is broken in the sense that we continue to talk about the social model while practicing medical model and deficit model approaches. So the time now is ripe, and really tension has grown, where increasingly service users are starting to question this and say, this discourse that you have talks about social model, whether it's in school boards or in accessibility services. But what we experience is on the ground is very much a deficit model or medical model approach. So when are you going to resolve that tension, resolve that contradiction, and actually move to a system that does what it preaches, right? Where there's sort of unity between practices and the discourse. The fourth one is a need for sustainability. Now, I've talked about sustainability already, but as when I talked about demand and demographics, but really we have to look at the fact that in 2023, you're hearing this word sustainability more and more. Any organizational, financial, and energetic production system is going to be judged on the fact that it can continue to do what it does with no increased resources. Now, can we do this? No, I've already said to you that we have increased demand. So we have increased demand, but we don't have more resources and more staffing. So if we're going to reach sustainability, we have to achieve it by doing things differently, not continuing to try and do things in the way we want, where the system is literally going to start cracking at the seams and not being able to survive. Here we're talking, and there's a bit of tech missing there, about individual sustainability. More and more you have teachers who are saying, I cannot do inclusion, I cannot do inclusion, I cannot do inclusion the way I'm supposed to do it. So again, through adaptation, etc. We have sustainability of teaching practices. We have entire schools, or school boards, or provinces, or at the higher education level, entire education departments, entire faculties saying we cannot continue to work with the model that we have now because it creates so much red tape and so much sort of procedural stress on the system that we cannot continue doing the things we want the way we're doing it. And then obviously there's the organizational, and that's what's missing here, the organizational sustainability, in the sense that it is too costly. It is vastly expensive to continue doing things the way we're doing it. And I'm going to suggest next week that there is a financially more sustainable way to do this better than the way we're doing it now, in terms of even financial sustainability, even if we look at organizational, entire institutions. The fifth element is the growing power of the student voice. There are more and more students able to advocate for themselves, and when they advocate for themselves, as early as middle school, they're advocating for whole class approaches that do not stigmatize them, that do not request medical documentation, that do not set them aside in the classroom by making them look different. So that culture now is at sort of really at the, again, cracking stage, where the tradition that we have of teaching, which requires all these things, stigmatization, separate approaches, documentation, all of these things, are now clashing with the expectations of the growing expectation of the population. And that's really problematic, because that's creating a lot of tension. And every year, every week, literally at the moment, you're seeing news items, complaints of the Human Rights Commission, letters written to newspapers, etc., where you can see this clash between sort of historical teaching culture and the expectations of that new generation. The last system you're very familiar with, I'm not going to spend too long on, but the other thing which needs to change is that so far we've talked very much about diversity and learner diversity in terms of impairment and disability. The last few years have shown us that really diversity is about many other things. You've had the Me Too movement, which has made us think about gender and gender inequities. You've had the Black Lives Matter, which has been dramatically important in North America to show us that that racialization is something that needs to be taken into account in terms of diversity and inclusion. Then you've had the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and its calls for actions. You've had all the talk at the moment about sexual orientation, gender identity, and trans rights, etc. I think there has never been so much societal sort of momentum for change, and schools and post-secondary institutions are very much under pressure to step up and to translate that change which is happening around us in society into our classroom practices. So more and more we're going to look at a link between inclusion and equity, diversity, and inclusion. You've probably seen this word EDI, and really widening the scope of what we do to go beyond impairment and disability. And that again makes the current practices obsolete and inadequate, because they are only focused on documented diagnostic impairment. So I hope you have food for thought here. It's a very quick overview. This is very topical. This is a slide that I'm going to use tomorrow when I make my presentation at that conference. So it is something very real, something that I certainly talk about constantly with partners in the field. You have a homework on this. I'm going to ask you to provide one of your own examples as to how current approaches to traditional approaches to inclusion, either in K-12 or in post-secondary in your own home country, are also cracking the seams, are also starting to look inadequate, obsolete, old, antiquated, and that there's a push for change. And so obvious evidence that this is no longer working. So if you could all provide one of these examples, if you have a news item or a website or something that you can show as evidence, that'd be great as well. So it's not a big homework, but we do have to take week 8 to sort of collect our thoughts about everything we've seen so far and the extent to which it shows that really practices as they are no longer working. And so this course is also about understanding that complexity, but understanding what we need to do now to move forward. It's not just a course that asks you to evidence what is going wrong, but to also be change agents and think about how things need to change. And we'll look at that next week. Okay, so I look forward to seeing you next week on the 14th. And I hope that you're doing okay with finishing assignment 2 if you've not done so already and posting it, and also focusing on your assignment 6, your e-portfolio.